on. We're just giving a little bit more time for people to get on board here. I see a few more people signing in, and then we'll get started with our role of branding and the future of SharePoint. I should say the role of branding in the future of SharePoint. We all know SharePoint's going to be just fine in the future. But branding, on the other hand, we've got some good questions to talk about. So before we get started here, let's just cover a couple things. This session is brought to you by SharePointVideos.com. It's a great website, and I'd encourage everybody to take a look at it. They've got some awesome offerings for learning SharePoint and some really cool stuff for organizations that want to help bring SharePoint knowledge to everybody in their organization. So I definitely encourage you to take a look. All right, today's panelists, we've got John Ross, MVP. We've got Randy Drisgill, MVP, and Yaroslav, I'm hoping I'm saying this right, Pentsarskyy, MVP, or sometimes people call him a VMP. It depends on the day. But anyway, hi guys, how are you all doing?
Hey there.
Why don't we take a minute and just introduce ourselves. John, why don't you go ahead and go first and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is John Ross. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP, actually based out of Orlando, Florida, and I work for Rackspace. So I'm a product manager there. Hey, look, there's my picture. I blog. You can check out my blog at the WordPress address there, and there's my Twitter. Haven't really blogged as much as I probably should have lately, but work at Rackspace doing SharePoint type things, and written a few books on SharePoint branding. So Randy and I kind of work together doing a lot of the presenting and talking about branding. So
sounds like a good segue for Randy. Randy, tell us a little about yourself that John hasn't already spilled.
Yeah, well, John and I do share a lot of the same attributes. I'm also MVP SharePoint Server. At Rackspace, I manage our SharePoint Dev and UX team, and like John said, I'm also in Orlando, Florida, and we worked on a few books on branding design, and you can check out my blog there. I just posted something recently on CSOM and SharePoint branding that some folks might find interesting.
I saw that, actually. That looked pretty interesting. Yaroslav, how are you doing today?
Good, good. So my name is Yaroslav Pentsarskyy, SharePoint MVP as well. So I work at Avanade in Canada, Vancouver, Canada, and my blog here is sharemuch.com and my Twitter as well. Also written a couple of books, or 4 books, around branding and SharePoint development. That's it about me.
Awesome. Let's do this here. We'll go to the next housekeeping. Just a quick note. We are giving away a 1-year subscription to SharePointVideos.com. That's almost a $200 value. And all you need to do to qualify is essentially to ask a question. So down at the bottom of your GoToWebinar screen, you'll see an area where you can ask a question. And if you have questions about branding, go ahead and put them out there, and we will try to get these answered. And we'll someone's going to be a lucky winner and have some awesome SharePoint videos to take a look at. So let's take a look at some questions here. I think one of the first things that we talked about here is it always comes up is can SharePoint can we make SharePoint look like it's not SharePoint, right? So you guys are all experts on that. What do you have to say about changing the look and feel of SharePoint?
Yeah, I think you can definitely.
Right.
Yeah, I'll chime in real quick, and then you can kind of pile on. But I mean, I think when it comes to SharePoint, you can kind of do, especially SharePoint 2013. I think you can do a lot of design that you could do in just the standard web in SharePoint. Now, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy to do that. In a lot of cases, you have more work to do to sort of make these designs work. But there's a lot of things you can do, HTML5, CSS3, all that kind of stuff in SharePoint 2013 these days. And it's just a matter of kind of thinking through, how far do you want to take your SharePoint? And, it depends if it's a collaborative type of SharePoint or if it's, a intranet portal that you're dealing with. Those may have more sort of branding and UI than, say, a collaborative intranet might.
I brought up a link here to topsharepoint.com. This is a website that has SharePoint sites that are out there that have been modified so that they don't look like SharePoint. It's a great resource. I think one of you guys had actually told me about it. Let's see, what other questions have we got there? Let's take a look here. One thing that I heard this pretty recently. John, you might have been the one that told me this. Is there some debate right now about whether we should be branding SharePoint Online sites at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, so some of the discussion that's gone on whenever Randy and I presented at the SharePoint conference back in, I don't even remember, was it March? We presented on branding in SharePoint, and some of the guidance that was being communicated to us from Microsoft at the time was for branding in SharePoint Online, the recommended approach, or I would say the guidance was use the composed looks. If you're not on 2013, you might, and you're on like 2010. Composed looks are the new theme engine for 2013. So when you talk about branding, they're kind of suggesting that you should use composed looks to accommodate for any time they would happen to update or change the code in SharePoint Online to make sure that it doesn't break anything. So the guidance that we've been passing along to everybody is if you want to do branding in Office 365, SharePoint Online, composed looks, definitely going to be okay with that. If you wanted to go with something like a custom master page or overridden CSS or something like that, you certainly do it. You just have to be aware that sometimes there might be some changes that Microsoft makes to Office 365 that may cause you to have to go in and make some fixes. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's the general guidance is just be aware of kind of what you're getting into and know that some of those hiccups may happen throughout the process.
Sure. And like Randy and Yaroslav, why don't you guys chime in? What's the worst that would happen to somebody if they were to do some branding like that and something were to change down the road? What would they expect to see?
Well, I can chime in here. What happened to me recently is one of the things that, or not recently, several times on different occasions, one of the things that people like to tackle most or change around the most in SharePoint Online is the suite bar, the little ribbon on the top. So I would recommend absolutely not to touch it because Microsoft changes that quite regularly, and actually there's been an update pushed last night or a couple of days ago that changed it again. So whatever you do, don't play with it much in terms of branding, because the worst thing that will happen is that basically your JavaScript may break, or some of the elements that you anticipate that are going to be there. HTML elements will not be there. The rendering of the components are going to change. So if you have any JavaScript that touches those components, it'll break, resulting in JavaScript errors and some of the custom functionality that you have not working. So that's potentially the worst thing that can happen, and I've certainly seen it on a couple of sites. So common symptom is someone calls you at weird time of day and or morning and says, I can't access the site, the slider is broken, nothing's working. So
sure,
don't want that.
Actually, we have some people doing some branding right now, and the menu that shows up under this cog on the right-hand side here, I could see the first item and the last item, and I couldn't see anything else. I couldn't pick anything else. It was very frustrating, right? So branding for sure has got its challenges here. Let's change topics for a second. What do we think about like Bootstrap and things like that, device channels in terms of development, and what's easier? What do you recommend there?
I think, this is Randy, I think Bootstrap is interesting. I think, things like UI frameworks that you can kind of use to sort of update your look and feel without having to like do a lot of background work. Like I recently used Bootstrap on a non-SharePoint project, and it's extremely helpful. I think the challenge when bringing something like Bootstrap into SharePoint, though, is that you kind of have to remember that you're dealing with an app that Microsoft has created. So things like the suite bar and the ribbon and things like that, they could react differently when you bring in something like Bootstrap and there's like a CSS reset that happens and that kind of thing. So I think it's particularly good for publishing sites, portals, that kind of thing. When you get into collaborative stuff, it could be a little bit more challenging to use a framework like this that sort of changes a lot of things. I think you just need to do a lot of testing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I have to say I really, really respect the work of anybody who does any kind of website front-end design, right? I think there's a lot of people that don't understand how difficult it is to deal with all the CSS stuff and deal with all the different browsers and all that kind of stuff, right? It's definitely a challenge, and hopefully some of what we've got today is going to help. Randy forwarded over a link. I just want to bring this up and show it to everybody. This is the Office blog here, and this is outlining some changes that are coming down in terms of their interface They're going to be adding this little grid here that pops out and things like that, right? So these are the kind of things that if you have customized a master page and you took what was there today, which maybe is one giant div across the whole thing, right? And you create your own div, and then they update their master page and they add this div, then you're not going to have that, right? So those are the kind of things that we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that change is tied into the suite bar, and so if you even just made a copy of the default Seattle master page and just made a couple edits, you probably wouldn't get this suite bar when they send the updates out. And so it's something that if you're going to be changing master pages, you need to be aware of what's coming down the pipe and decide, do I want that new feature? Do I need to change what I did to sort of match that, et cetera?
Is there anybody out there who's got a master page watch service that downloads the master page every day and does like a WinDiff or something of the old one and then like you could subscribe to a mailing list to find out when things have changed?
It's interesting you mentioned that. I was thinking about doing that the other day, and I messed around with something that would do like some auto diffs daily, but I didn't really get it all proofed out yet. But
okay, well,
like that
maybe
could be very beneficial for people.
Yeah, well, I would say for everybody then, let's see, and that was that John talking just now?
That's Randy.
Randy, hey Randy. So everybody, we might want to follow some of the folks that are on this panel right now. Randy's Twitter handle is at DRISGILL. Maybe that's something we can look forward to seeing from one of us in the future, because I think that'd definitely be a handy thing.
Hey Jack, I wanted to kind of, as we're going through and talking about this, and this is John, by the way.
Hey John.
As we're going through and we're talking about some of this stuff, I think we kind of jumped in and we're talking about kind of the role of branding in the future. And I think we started off talking about kind of it as, branding from a design perspective. When we look at like Bootstrap and some of the other things, we're kind of diving into, the functional role of branding. So, I mean, when we talk about branding and why somebody would do branding, I think that there's a lot of different reasons. I just want to make sure we're clear on, kind of sometimes branding is purely cosmetic, sometimes it's functional, and sometimes it's actually to add usability. And so I know, when we're thinking about branding holistically, we're kind of thinking about it in, SharePoint isn't always like the most user-friendly whenever, if you have a certain situation, people are investing and spending, creating portals and things like that. They want to drive adoption and make it easier to get around. And I think branding is really a way to not only, make the site look not necessarily like SharePoint, but people want it to not just look like SharePoint, but also they want it to function like they want it to function. And so I want to make sure we don't lose sight of that Bootstrap is a great example of, driving some of that, UX changes that really more modern and kind of can connect with users in kind of a more personal way.
Hey, I've got a question here from looks like Auburn, asking, can SharePoint be totally responsive, right? So talking about responsive web design and what have you, what are Yaroslav, what's your opinion in terms of responsive web design, and can we get there 100%, or what's the best we can hope to achieve with SharePoint?
Sure. I mean, you can get as far, as SharePoint out of the box lets you, right? So you can certainly build anything. If you open SharePoint, it's all just a bunch of HTML and CSS that's already been there, and you can certainly add your own, but you have to understand that there are certain features, just as we talked about the suite bar, right? There are certain features that will have their certain behavior anyway, and you have to keep them. So those are the constraints, I would say. So yes, you can make it very responsive, especially public sites and SharePoint Online. You can go pretty far. The master page is pretty minimalistic there, but you still have to be aware of things that are there that may make it not so responsive. And you can disable some of them, but there's that fact.
Sure. Any quick thoughts on like responsive web design versus like these device channels and things like that?
So in terms of so obviously device channels is the feature that we can use. The responsive web design is kind of a more of a approach that's not tied to particularly in SharePoint, right? So obviously it's something that's that spans web technologies in general. So using rules in responsive web design is definitely something that I would choose over relying on some of the standard features.
Okay. I've got a couple questions from people here.
Quick on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I I was just going to say, I mean, I think the big difference with responsive to like device channels is that device channels are really keying off of sort of like browser agent strings, where the responsive is keying off of features that your browser may have, and so it's a little bit of sort of a decision matrix you can use. But in general, you could use the two together sort of to make a site that both responds to the browser and to features in the browser. And also, I think that responsive, again, is a lot nicer in like a public-facing site or a portal versus a collaborative type of SharePoint site, because a lot of the collaborative features in SharePoint weren't built to be responsive. So like calendars, and Gantt charts, and lists, and things like that, you know, you would have to do a lot of work to sort of make those be responsive.
Well, yeah, this is John. I think that's one of the big things that I think everybody on this panel would agree that responsive is, you know, is awesome, and you know, it's really powerful. But it is a little bit harder. You know, in order to do it, takes a little bit more time and effort. And so that's just one of the things that if you're thinking about, you know, how do you want to set up your site, you just have to make sure that if you do decide that you want to go responsive, you make sure that you do it right, because you know, responsive done right is an awesome experience for your users, but it is harder, and you have to make sure that you have the skill set on the people that are doing it and the budget in order to kind of do everything the way it should be.
Yep. I've got an example here of a responsive website that Randy just pinged me over. So I think almost everybody on this call probably knows what responsive is, but just in case you haven't seen it, you know, here's a site that as we start to collapse it, notice the picture starting to shrink in, right? And our column sizes are adjusting with us. We get small enough here, you can see the menu just dropped underneath, right? We get smaller still, and we've got a menu that would be appropriate for a mobile phone, right? So this is, you know, if you aren't already familiar with it, this is what responsive web design is all about. And the neat thing is this is all done through CSS and a single template, right? We noticed we didn't have to go to a mobile dot, you know, SPC waffles or anything. We didn't have to go to a different site. We didn't have to redraw anything. We didn't have to go back to the server. It's all based on layout, based on the width of the browser and different settings that are picked up that way. I've got a lot of questions on the call here. We've got Radu and a few other people. I can't even name all of them. A lot of people are asking about Office 365. So let's spend some time on that and give us your thoughts, you know, on Office 365 branding. And I'm going to try and go through as you guys are talking and pick up, because there are some you know, some are general questions, some are very specific. So I'll try to pick up those questions from you guys in the audience as we do this. So Yaroslav, why don't you, have you worked with Office 365? Can you comment on branding there?
Yeah, absolutely. For past several years, and in fact, on some of the projects right now, we're doing Office 365. It's becoming very, very popular. In fact, for past year, this 2014, I have not done on-premises project branding. So it's all moving to the cloud, even for, you know, medium-sized customers. So some of the key thoughts there with branding is a lot of things are possible. One of the things that I would recommend for if you're not generally a developer, but you do branding, is make sure you pair up with developers, because there's a lot of components such as content search web part. There's a content query web part. So which are more increasingly used in SharePoint Online to drive a variety of features. So you may want to get a handle on how to brand those. So not just generic, you know, master page and page layout branding, but also, you know, pair up with developers or read up on how to brand components, especially content search web parts. Because you can essentially, with things like content search web parts, which is essentially a roll-up of things on the site, you can convert it into things like sliders. You can convert it into carousels, you know, all sorts of components. So rather than building something from scratch and writing a whole bunch of JavaScript, you can reuse existing components like that with just a bit of a touch of JavaScript and CSS. You can make them look apart without significant investment.
Hey, one of the questions, this was asked by, I think, Sridhar, is it possible to develop branding for online as an app? Like, what is the method for getting branding into your online sites? Because it's a little different than on-premise, right?
Yeah, very good question. So there's a long debate in the community around should we use apps for branding. So certainly you can develop things like individual components like carousels and sliders. Those can be packaged as an app because you can add an app part to the page, and that app part will have the functionality that you want. In terms of actually provisioning master page to the site, or provisioning page layouts or CSS files, JavaScript, basically provisioning your package to the site. It's possible, but it's much harder than using an approach, for example, of a declarative sandbox solution. But the debate that I mentioned comes from the fact that Microsoft discourages using sandbox solution. So one thing that I want to point out there is that the sandbox solutions that are discouraged are solutions that contain code behind. Declarative sandbox solutions, which are solutions that provision master pages, layouts, CSS, and JavaScript, those are just declarative solutions. In fact, out-of-the-box feature Design Manager uses sandbox solution framework to do just that.
If I can interject in here, Carol in the chat room asked a question about how difficult it is to use like Dreamweaver, for example, to integrate with SharePoint Online or on-premise. Can you talk about, does Design Manager is only available for certain types of sites, right? So are there limitations in when you can use something like Dreamweaver versus when you can't?
Yeah, I would say, this is Randy, I would say, for the Design Manager feature, which is part of the publishing feature in SharePoint, so it would only be available to publishing sites, that feature sort of allows you to build branding using HTML technology, not having to necessarily know all the ins and outs of master pages. And so they kind of built that feature with Dreamweaver and other tools like that in mind, so that you work with an HTML and they have like little previews of kind of what the different controls look like in the HTML, and then you can kind of design it in Dreamweaver, and then when you hit save, it can update the corresponding master page. But like you said, that technology is really more geared towards a publishing site versus a collaboration site.
And Carol, just to answer your question too, as far as Dreamweaver goes and doing that stuff, what you end up doing is you map a network drive to a folder in SharePoint where this stuff is stored at. And when you go to do it, it actually guides you through. There's like a step-by-step process, and there's links to, if not how to do it right on SharePoint, there's a link to an article on Microsoft's website on how to map the drive and things like that. So it's not too terribly difficult, I would say.
Well, let me just weigh in here. I think one of the things Design Manager was meant to kind of make the process a little bit easier for traditional designers who are familiar with kind of using Dreamweaver. One of the challenges is that I always tell the story that Randy and I used to work together. I don't even know how many years ago on the first SharePoint project we ever did as a non-SharePoint specific designer. He came in, tried to remove a search box off the master page and broke everything, and he got really frustrated. And I think that that's the experience a lot of people have with SharePoint is, when they start branding it, they want to do something simple, it breaks everything, and they get mad. Design Manager was created to try to help get people over that hurdle, which is, would allow them to get farther in the process. So Design Manager definitely does help you get your design in and get going a little bit farther, but you do run into a point, though, where you still have to have some SharePoint-specific understanding of kind of the controls and other things other things that are going on the page. So it's definitely a good starting point, and it does help. But I mean, the original goal was to kind of almost make it so a non-designer could just do SharePoint design, which helps, but there's still that line, and I want to make sure that resources like this discussion and like everybody's blog that's on the panel and everything are still pretty important.
So one thing I wanted to add to that is if you're only focusing on branding on a particular project, you got to have someone who does the development, who understands the back end. Quite honestly, I don't believe just knowing CSS and being put on a SharePoint project is something that's going to last long, right? Because at some point you will have to have certain interaction with some of the features that you have to understand. So unless you're a SharePoint branding person or you're the branding person who understands the platform, I'd recommend certainly on a project, if you're staffing a project, to have someone who understands the development.
Yeah, that's a good point for everybody that's listening. I think it's I think that not everybody is fortunate to have a Yaroslav or a Randy on their project. So kind of pairing those designers with those developers can really make your lives much easier on projects.
All right, let's take a look at some other questions here we've got. Somebody wanted to know, this is actually a good question, can we brand SharePoint Foundation?
Yes, you can. I think, so this is John. I'll just say I think the thing that we always talk about is, going back to the design manager discussion, Foundation doesn't have a design manager. That doesn't mean you can't brand it. The guidance that we give is that you can still go ahead, you can make custom master pages, you can still do custom CSS, things like that. Randy has I don't know if we've shown, but Randy has his starter master pages, which can help people get started on doing some of those things. But the methods that you would use for, say, branding Foundation would just kind of go back to kind of what we would call sort of the classic SharePoint branding, which is more kind of just using a starter master page and overriding some CSS. But yeah, absolutely, you can still brand it.
Yep, and another great option is composed looks. Kind of like the old themes type idea. That's still available to you in Foundation, and you could do a lot with just, especially in 2013, because they added sort of backgrounds and they added sort of some nicer color combinations. You can kind of pick a composed look, add a site logo into your site, and kind of get a lot of traction out of just doing that as well, if you don't want to get into master pages and CSS.
Somebody had a question. I'm trying to find it here. Was it Bill? Or it might have been Steve. We got the Foundation question there. Oh, now I just lost my train of thought. So why don't you guys pipe in with something? I'll find another question to ask in a minute here. Cynthia did ask about SharePoint Designer. She said she doesn't have it.
We had a previous topic. Oh, the Design Manager, the SharePoint Designer. Yeah, so SharePoint Designer is free for you to download, but there's also a lot of other options you can use for editing master pages and CSS and even page layouts. Like, I frequently just use Notepad++ just to do a lot of my work. And in 2013, because you can map a drive to the master page gallery now, it makes a lot of that really nice. You can just map a drive, and then you can sort of pop open and start editing master pages and that kind of thing. And then when you're done, save them off, and then go in through the SharePoint UI and publish, major versions so that other people can see them. So you definitely don't need to have SharePoint Designer to sort of do a lot of this stuff now.
And I think Cynthia had asked a question about, she said she didn't have SharePoint Designer. It's a free download. You can get it right from Microsoft. So unless you've got some kind of a restriction on your PC at work that would keep you from doing that, there's definitely not a financial burden there. Vicky's asked a question: can we run SharePoint Designer 2010 and 2013 on the same machine? Any issues there?
I like to keep them separate. I don't know if anyone here does.
Okay, and then it sounded like Yaroslav, were you trying to? Somebody talk.
I was going to say something. You can run the two on the same machine. The challenge ends up being though that if you have 2013, you're going to use it. You're going to use that for branding for whatever you are accessing on SharePoint Online or SharePoint 2013. But if you had SharePoint 2010, you're going to need the probably the older version. So you might be able to go back and forth between it. Someone else might know better than I, but
well, I know you definitely can't. Like you were saying, you can't use SharePoint Designer 2013 to edit a 2010 site, and vice versa. Whether you can have them on the same machine or not, I'm not sure. I don't do it that way. I use a lot of virtual machines, and so I kind of keep one. I keep the 2010 one on my 2010 VM and 2013 on my 2013 VM.
Now, interesting to note there. Obviously, you never had to run SharePoint Designer on the server itself, right? So it's pretty common that somebody might run Designer off of their desktop PC.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And not have to worry about that. As far as I know, I think you can install them both. I don't think there's an issue there. So I think that's.
Oh yeah, you definitely can install them both. I just that will absolutely work. I think in the past, and I'll just kind of just say that in the past there have been some challenges because, like from a resources perspective, when you installed them in different orders, like if you installed, say, 2013 and then later went in and installed 2010, sometimes there were some quirks where, it just has to do with the, software, whatever was the last driver installed or whatever. So you just might want to be careful with some of that stuff. Make sure that 2013 is the latest one you installed.
Right. Hey, Karen's asked a question about composed looks, and she says, can you create composed looks with PowerPoint like you can in 2010? Does that functionality still exist?
No.
No. Okay. So that's an easy one.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very similar concept, but like you were saying, in 2010 you created them with SharePoint. You created them with PowerPoint and saved off a THMX file and then uploaded that. In 2013, you're basically just edit some XML files that are in a gallery, and so they've sort of switched it, but the concept is extremely similar to how it works between the two.
Well, composed looks are much better. I mean, honestly, one of the frustrations we had from a branding perspective on themes in 2010 was basically, even though they were really simple to use and even though they didn't require you to go on the server to upload files, you were really just kind of picking like 12 different colors and a couple fonts. And it kind of reskinned SharePoint, but it really didn't change the look too much. And one of the other things was, of those colors that you picked, it really wasn't too obvious where the colors that you picked were going to show up. And those colors that you picked each also showed up in different tints. So depending on, you didn't know which let's say, intensity of which color was going to show up where. And so doing any type of decent-looking branding, even though it was easy, was kind of hard. And composed looks now give you a lot more flexibility with being able to go in and kind of put a background image and kind of do something that actually looks. You can actually do some pretty great looking stuff with just composed looks. They're pretty powerful.
Hey, Charles had a question. This is one of those things I think people who've been doing this for a while take for granted. You want to know, is Design Manager the same as Designer?
No.
It's definitely not. But in some ways, though, Microsoft was sort of intending it to take the place of SharePoint Designer, in that in 2013, for SharePoint Designer, there's not the design view where you can kind of see things visually and kind of click on them. And the reason for that was, the new SharePoint 2013 has got a modern HTML design, so they would have had to refresh that design view and kind of put some coding effort behind it. And so rather than do that, they put a lot of effort into this Design Manager feature so that people can kind of use that to do their design. But in a lot of ways, the two things are different, right? The SharePoint Designer is more of, get in there and work with your site and work with the code, where the Design Manager is really just a thing that converts HTML master pages to actual master pages.
And
right.
And there's definitely overlap between the two. I mean, there's certain things that you can do in both of them.
And I think the big distinguishing thing is that SharePoint Designer is an executable that you download and you run it on your machine, right? Design Manager is a functionality or a feature of SharePoint 2013 and Office 365, SharePoint Online, where it's kind of a, I don't know, you can almost describe it as a workflow, right? I mean, it's a slightly different way of editing your master pages and things like that, right? So
I almost think that they should rename SharePoint Designer, because without the design view in it, it's almost really just a tool for working with your site.
Yeah, it's SharePoint workflow tools, right? And I understand workflow's gotten better in Designer, so I mean, it definitely has some value out there. All right. One of the questions that came out here, let's see here. I've heard from Microsoft. They would like to update Office 365 every 90 days. And this is from, who is this one from? From Jupe. Could these updates disrupt Office 365 branding?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yep, that's a resounding yes. And also, like, if you listen, like, Jeremy Thake has a podcast where he talks to various Microsoft folks, and in one of the latest ones, they did some UX talk, and they actually talk about how the updates, like minor updates and fixes, go in there like every 2 weeks even. And so while you may have major features coming in, like Delve and things like that, in 90 days, if they find something that's broken, they'll go in and fix it, on the fly, so to speak. And so I think one thing they talk about is, like, if you do a lot of sort of keying off the HTML DOM for either jQuery or for CSS, Like, that's stuff that could change at any given time in SharePoint Online. So
Yeah.
something to consider.
Like even last night, I've noticed, the suite bar, going back to the suite bar, it changed the way, the thickness of it a little bit more even, and added some contrast. So there's certainly things happening on a weekly basis.
Steve had a good
and that's
question.
why, that's why.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, going back to the previous discussion, that's why we were saying if you're doing branding if you're doing branding in Office in SharePoint Online, you want to make sure that you're aware that some of those things can happen and you plan for it. And if you're okay with it, that's great. If it's something where this is concerning to you and you have high amount of customizations and you're don't want to deal with it, then those are the types of things that going toward doing your branding outside of Office 365 would probably be a better approach for you.
So one of the things I also wanted to suggest I didn't get a chance to mention is so folks were saying, well, how do I know that updates are coming up? So there is an option in SharePoint Online Admin Center under Settings, and there's a toggle, right? There's a radio button that says give me preview features, yes or no, or something to that extent. So what you can do, like if you're a medium-sized organization that cannot tolerate disruptions, you can set up a tenant, like a test tenant, where you could have that turned on and see what breaks on a daily basis or a weekly basis, if you like, and then have the preview features turned off in your production tenant. That way.
One thing they mentioned on that podcast, which I found interesting, is that Jeremy mentioned that while that feature is good for the big things, even with it not turned on, they'll still be updating minor things as you go, which I found very interesting.
Right. Okay. So something to be aware of.
Hey, switching gears here, Steve had a question. I think this is pretty relevant. Basically said, basically need to know what power users can do and cannot do regarding Office 365, and I presume he means in ways of branding, right? With things like Design Manager and the the different templates and stuff like that, what are things that that we might expect a user to muck with versus things that only somebody who's got the proper permissions are going to get in and change?
So certainly,
that's a good question.
I don't know. Yeah.
I was going to say that's a good question. I think part of the I would almost ask the question back, and in terms of, I know when I think of a power user, and we talk about permissions, I guess I would probably go back and want to clarify, at what level are we looking at the power user? Because you could have a power user that's kind of like a site owner, and a site owner may actually have permissions to go in and change compose looks and things like that. And so, but in other organizations, your power users or your site owners might have less ability to do things. I don't know. What Yaroslav, what do you think about that?
So very, very good point, right? So so as far as I'm concerned, power users should not be touching code, right? So unless they have specific skills, but then they're not really power user, right? So power users should only be using things that are in SharePoint, the toggles, the flyouts to configure SharePoint, not really something, let me Google something. All right, that's the JavaScript. I'm going to go and open up master page and put that JavaScript and see what happens, right? That just causes problems later. And that's like if you're a smaller organization, then you can tolerate something, you can tolerate the site being down for a day because, the power user is away at that point. Then that's okay. Then it's a risk that you accept. But most organizations, even smaller organizations, they don't really tolerate that. It's a site that they go to every day, and then So my rule of thumb is power users should not be touching code. I don't know if you guys, Jack, Randy.
And I can say Steve that asked that question, he did pipe in and say, hey, power user meaning not a developer or a professional CSS or master page designer. So
yeah,
then which I think is probably like 99.9% of all people out there, right? So
yeah.
I think the compose looks are a great answer for that. You could do a lot with just configuring, things in the web UI, not touching CSS, not touching master pages, etc.
And there's a very good reason for that, right? Because you install Office 365 for its economical benefits and for its features, right? You're not really going to want to customize every single bit out of it. And if you do, then you hire someone that can do it in a proper manner, right? But if you're a power user, just basically stick to composed looks, stick to the features that you can turn on and off through the UI.
Sure. Here's a question for Randy. This is from Fred. Are you guys going to cover the future of on-premise branding?
I think that's a good question as well, right? I think that's sort of like look in your crystal ball, type of question, right? But I think what you could probably assume, right, because they've announced there'll be future versions of SharePoint Server, on-prem. And I'm guessing what you're going to see is certain features from 365 will or from SharePoint Online will sort of make it into the on-prem product. And I guess the question will be which features make it in. Probably the ones that aren't super dependent on, other services that are only online, right? And so I don't think we know exactly, but we've got things like in 365 they're introducing that like app launcher thing that's going into the suite bar. Will that be something we get in the future version of on-prem? Quite possibly, I don't know. And so it's things like that where I think because we have O365 and SharePoint Online, we kind of get a little bit of a glimpse into what could potentially be in the next version, right? And so that's how you could kind of start thinking about where should I be taking my UI. And so we talked earlier, like maybe you shouldn't be messing with the suite bar too much. I think that's probably a good, safe assumption for on-prem as well.
So if you think about the types of audiences, and just to add to Randy's thought, it's absolutely true, right, that we don't necessarily know 100%, but think about the type of audience who's using on-premises SharePoint, and think about the type of audience that uses SharePoint Online, right? Those are different. There are different purposes, right, for these. Almost you could say, right? So it's for the same reason that we have still customers that are using IE8 because of some of their corporate applications, requiring functionality there. There's the same reason why there's a SharePoint on-premise because there's certain functionalities and certain flexibility that's required by those customers, and that functionality will remain there at the cost of some of the newer features potentially not being available, right? So and those customers are perfectly fine with that. They're okay that they're not going to have an app launcher on the suite bar, but they can customize the login page for because they have a complicated multi-factor authentication. So
I think that's a great point. Like you could do more in an on-prem environment, right? That's where you can really get into your customizations, like you were just saying, like your login screens and things like that.
Yeah.
Randy, here's a question I think that probably goes well with this article that you just wrote here, right? And Rob is asking, it seems like a lot of SPO customizations require JavaScript. Do you guys get worried about so much client-side scripting?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I get worried about it necessarily, but I do think the observation is definitely true, right? The direction Microsoft seems to be guiding us along is sort of do your customizations using client-side object model, client-side code, that kind of thing, and probably because now that they run SharePoint themselves, they really don't want us writing any server-side code whatsoever, right? And so client-side code gives them the ability to say, hey, you guys can still do customizations, but just keep them sort of in this world, so to speak. And so it's interesting. We're kind of shifting everything to the browser, processor versus the server processor, and then obviously you have to start worrying about browser differences and things like that. And so I think there are sort of challenges there, for sure. But I think it's interesting. I think if you look at this article about they seem to be asking people to use this CSOM code that the Patterns and Practices team has released to sort of push out branding to 365 to upload it and apply it versus using a sandbox solution. And I think there's some interesting pros and cons there where a sandbox solution is sort of more declarative, where the CSOM you're kind of coding, you're doing a lot more coding to get your files up there.
John, maybe you can answer this one. I think it's either Basil or Basil asked a question. Moving from SharePoint 10 to 13, 2010, 2013, to SharePoint Online, does it keep the website branding consistent? Is it a straightforward process, or do you need to rebrand every time?
Unfortunately, with a lot of questions in the SharePoint world, the answer ends up being it depends. I think for the most part, you can keep your branding somewhat similar. Like if you had a lot of your CSS can stay the same and things like that. But there's been enough changes between 2010 and 2013. You can't just really like take it all one for one. I know Randy and I have gone through this a lot. This is a common question that we get asked. I think this moral of the story ends up being you don't have to start over. You know, you can pull some stuff forward, but it still requires a little bit of work on your part. I don't know, Randy. I know you normally weigh in on some of this stuff.
Sure. I mean, I think my take on it is, you know, when you're doing a lot of the branding, if you're doing CSS, and CSS is tied to the HTML DOM, and in 2013 they sort of updated the HTML that runs 2013 to be more modern. And so a lot of your CSS classes that you're overriding are going to change and things like that. And then you're also going to need to start with a different starter master page. And so like if you have a 2010 master page in CSS, you want to go to 2013, check out my starter master pages, and then sort of move your stuff from the 2010 to the 2013 master page. That way you still have the ribbon and things like that that are, you know, the way they are in 2013 versus the way they were in 2010.
And also, so the question is talks about also SharePoint Online. So one thing I wanted to add is, so obviously SharePoint Online is you know, it's a subset of SharePoint 2013 on its own, so to speak. So think about, so obviously there's two approaches. Just move things as they are, and that kind of limits you in terms of new things that you're going to get when you're migrating from 2010 to 2013 or SharePoint Online. Or maybe it's time for you to kind of step back and say, all right, well, why am I even migrating, and what else can I take advantage of? And maybe at that point you will consider some small redesign and some update, rather than just move as is.
Yeah, it's a great time to introduce, you know, branding changes, right? When you're going from a major version, because you're already going to have to make some changes.
Yaroslav, here's a question for you. We kind of already talked about this a little bit, but I think we've talked about all these different ways of branding. What's the quickest way? If you had to rebrand SharePoint 2013, you know, somebody's holding a gun to your head, what's the fastest way to do it? What do you think is the easiest?
The fastest way to do it, even if you're a larger organization, use SharePoint Designer or Notepad++, as Randy says, to open it up, because even if you have to follow like a proper deployment guide, you know, steps and deploy your branding in a certain way, use SharePoint Designer, make your changes on some sort of a test or development environment, and hand them off for a package for proper deployment. But I think the fastest way to see results, and we're doing it every time. Like all of our developers on projects, you know, especially UX developers that sometimes may not have the same depth of knowledge around SharePoint components. They use SharePoint Designer for their dev tenant, and then they kind of trickle down those changes to production in the package.
I would probably say though that I think composed looks are by far the fastest way. I mean, if you're looking to just, you know, get something up there, you upload a background image. I mean, Randy and I do it in our demos. You know, you can rebrand a site. Like if you had a new background image and knew what you wanted to do, you could do it in minutes.
Good point.
Yeah. So I mean, it really depends. I mean, I know when we're talking about an entire implementation, you know, we kind of think about the implementation in two pieces. We think of, you know, kind of the areas of the site that are going to be dedicated to communication, and the areas of the site that are going to be dedicated to collaboration. And the collaboration is normally where we kind of focus more on some of the composed looks and things like that. But I mean, there's definitely organizations that are kind of just, you know, need something more simple and quick. And composed looks, if you just have you get a corporate logo that you want to upload in the top, upload the corporate logo. You do like a little background image, maybe do some light CSS work. I mean, you could do it in minutes, hours, or, you know, if you wanted to do something a little bit nicer, you could probably spend a day or two with someone that knew some CSS and do something pretty nice.
I just want to pipe in. Lori had mentioned she missed part of the webinar. Wanted to know if it's going to be available later. It absolutely will be. We'll talk about that at the end. Okay, I've got a branding. I'm sorry. Well, I guess it'd be a branding for forms question from. I think I'm going to pronounce this Sulan. The question is, and think of who can answer this here. Regarding SharePoint form design, I was referring to the branding of the form itself. How to make it not look out of the box? How do you recommend making changes to forms when it comes to branding? Randy or Yaroslav, either of you have a thought on that?
So so question back. Depends what forms you're using. You know, there's list forms. You can get forms through Access web app. Certainly, if you're talking about the web forms in terms of list forms, there's always a possibility for you to, you know, through master page customizations or composed looks, to trickle down your customizations to forms as well. But if you need something elaborate, like if you need to add interaction on the form, like you know, let's say you have text boxes and you want some sort of custom behavior that requires JavaScript, you can also achieve that through you know, either through a master page or, quite honestly, in some edge cases, if it's just one-off form, you can add a content or a script editor web part right on the form.
And by the way, just want to chime in. The same person that asked that question said specifically list forms. This is what he's looking for.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about now.
Yeah.
Right now. So that's that. You know, customizations in terms of specific forms, you can always add a script editor right to those specific forms. Just be aware of the fact that, you know, if users have rights to remove those things, then they can affect your functionality. Right. So there's that, and also consider for a lot of things that I find people use forms or list forms. There can be an app in an app store, right? So, like, I know sometimes people need to collect some information for whatever purposes. Check out the online, especially if you're using SharePoint Online. The app store is right there; it's already configured. So check out some of the apps in the app store, because I find that a lot of those things are already there.
Sure. And I just want to pipe in. I think, if I remember right, you can get a SharePoint Online developer subscription. Isn't it like $99 a year or something like that? It's not the kind of thing you have to wait for your organization to jump on board with. If you're interested in learning about that stuff, it's pretty easy to do.
Yep.
I've got a question from Vicky. It's not quite branding related, but it kind of is in a way. She says, I've heard we'll no longer be able to create custom data view web parts. And that's something that we used to do in SharePoint Designer 2010. John, where are we with that today? Or Randy?
All right, so I just unmuted myself. But,
okay.
No, I'm here. Sorry. Mute on the webinar stuff is kind of a little bit slow to disengage. So, so in 2013, the functionality still exists. It's still something that you can do. There's but there's no interface in SharePoint Designer to do it. Because you used to be able to do that with the design view, and that's not there. You'd have to do something like you'd have to do it directly in the code view. Actually, I believe that there are some third-party products out there that do provide you an interface, and I haven't. I'm not really an expert in using them, but I believe Lightning Tools, if you're all are familiar with them, they actually created a 2013 product that will allow you to kind of create those data view web parts more easily through the browser. But it's not free, or it may be free. Actually, I'm not sure, but it is, you know, from a different provider that's not Microsoft, so check it out. Lightning Tools.
All right. Prince has a question here. It says, maybe it meant why. What can't we use Office 365 web parts like show personnel inboxes and calendars on SharePoint pages? Any comments on that one? How about Randy? Probably your turn to take the mic.
I don't know that one. I don't know. I haven't messed with those web parts. So I guess the question is, there's some web parts that are, yeah.
So some of the functionality in SharePoint Online depends on some of the backend features. You know, and since SharePoint Online is a shared infrastructure, things like, you know, email-enabled lists are not available. So some of the functionality may not be available purely just because it requires more elevated access or it doesn't work on the shared infrastructure. So those are kind of remains of SharePoint 2007 and 2010 when the product wasn't really 100% there. Not all the features in the product were running or compatible with the shared infrastructure. So that's why in SharePoint Online you may see some of the limitations around those features.
Awesome. I've got, I think, maybe time for one more question, and then we've got to wrap things up. This question might be pretty easy. Leanne was asking if we're going to have another webinar in the future, and Asif, I think, is on right now. Do you guys have any comments on that? I think we're planning to do these monthly, right?
Absolutely. So this is the first time I'm jumping in today, but we are hoping that these kind of questions and answer panels, discussions like this will continue on different topics and areas all throughout. So if you guys like what you hear, and there's still more, but if you guys like it, go ahead and let us know because we want to do this for you guys. Absolutely. And by the way, the recording for this one will also be available and will be made available through a notification to everybody who joined within 24 hours.
I just wanted to kind of touch base too here. We picked out a winner from the questions here. Her name is Karen. Am I allowed to say the last name, or do we keep just first name? Asif, you could probably
yes, you can say the last name. Go ahead.
All right. So Karen Kenyon has won a 1-year subscription to SharePointVideos.com. So congratulations, Karen. You'll get an email within the next 24 hours about that. So definitely check your email and make sure you don't have your spam filter too aggressive in the next 24 hours for sure. I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank the panelists, and also thank everybody who got online and got questions on there. So sorry for the ones that didn't. We had was there a question count here? Like literally, I think we had like 300 questions come through in the time that we had. So great participation from all of you, and thank you so much. Just a reminder, SharePointVideos.com is the group that's bringing this to you. Check out their website. They've got some great stuff. I'm going to put the slide back up for our speakers in case you wanted to capture their information or what have you. So there's everybody's blog and their Twitter handles. You can log that down. And again, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again in a future one of these things.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.